Chapter 1 The Dead. The immortal, Huang Zhengdao's last memory was of the black wall in the South Sea, connecting the sky and the ocean. The moment before, there was only the rumble of distant thunder deep within the leaden clouds. The sea wind carried salty, damp air across his skin, and the water still rose and fell docilely, supporting his lean, athletic body. The next moment, the sky seemed torn open by an invisible giant hand, and an ink-black curtain of rain hammered down, bone-chilling and instantly blurring the world. The gale was no longer wind, but countless invisible, savage whips lashing the sea surface, whipping up monstrous wave crests. The seawater, once familiar and friendly, had now transformed into a churning, roaring behemoth, every wave crest carrying crushing force, slamming down hard, then greedily dragging him toward the abyss. The will to survive burned in his blood and bones, squeezing power from every muscle fiber. Huang Zhengdao kicked desperately, but every arm stroke felt like struggling through viscous asphalt. The icy seawater poured into his mouth and nose, the salty stench shooting straight into his brain, nearly suffocating him. He exhausted all his strength to finally break the surface, only for an especially terrifying mountain of water to crash down on him, violently pressing him back underwater. Huang Zhengdao's ears were filled with a dull roar, and before his eyes was a murky darkness churning with countless bubbles. His lungs felt tightly squeezed by iron pincers, burning with searing pain. Instinctively, he paddled desperately upward, breaking through the heavy curtain of water. Just as he reached a sliver of thin air, he was seized by another, more insidious force. Less than 100 meters from the golden beach, which was being ripped apart by the gale, the sea surface suddenly collapsed. A gigantic whirlpool, silently and swiftly, opened its dark maw. The water spun and sank wildly, forming a bottomless funnel. The suction surpassed the limits of physics, carrying a greed that froze the soul. Huang Zhengdao felt his body lighten. All his struggles instantly became futile and ridiculous. He was violently dragged down by the irresistible force, like a helpless falling leaf plunging toward the bottomless abyss. Bone-chilling seawater pressed in from all directions. His bones seemed to groan. The last bit of air in his lungs was mercilessly squeezed out, turning into a string of desperate bubbles that quickly vanished into the increasingly dim, unreachable light above his head. Absolute darkness embraced him, heavy enough to suffocate. At the boundary where consciousness completely extinguished, deep within that all-consuming coldness and silence, a voice, ancient, smelling of salty sea rust, was directly branded onto the core of his disintegrating consciousness. What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. The sound was not heard by the ear, but was a brand etched onto his soul. It had no direction, no source, only an indifferent, eternal proclamation. At the exact same moment, on the other side of the world, beneath the rocky fortress of House Greyjoy on Pike Island, the heart of the Iron Islands, the fierce sea wind shrieked past the jagged black rocks, whipping up cold sea spray that lashed the faces of the people standing on the shore. The air was thick with an inescapable smell of sea salt and fish, along with a nearly solidified sense of solemnity. At the center of the crowd was the clan chief of House Greyjoy, Corran Greyjoy. He was tall, his face deeply etched by sea wind and years, his eyes as hard as rock, yet holding a hint of a new father's nervousness and anticipation. Standing beside him was his eldest son, Balon Greyjoy. Balon was only 12 years old, slender but already showing the distinct sharpness of House Greyjoy. He kept his thin lips tightly pressed, his sharp eyes, inherited from his father, fixed intently ahead. He tried hard to mimic his father's steady demeanor, but his slightly clenched small fists and slightly hastened breathing betrayed his inner turmoil. This was the moment his younger brother was about to undergo the test. Only a few people were present. 2 solemn-faced drowned men-priests, and Harrig, Corran's most trusted ship captain and aide. The altar was a naturally formed, massive rock basin, smoothed by the sea. Currently, it was filled with bone-chilling seawater churning with white foam. The chief drowned man-priest, an old man with white hair and beard, soaked through, his eyes burning with the fire of fanaticism, stood barefoot in the waist-deep water. In his hands, rough as bark, he held an infant wrapped in coarse, dark gray seaweed cloth. Corran's second son, Euron Greyjoy, newly born into the world. Drowned god! The old priest's voice was hoarse and high-pitched, piercing the howling sea wind. Look upon your humble creation. Grant him the hardness of the Ironborn. Grant him the breath of the sea. Let him undergo your baptism, and return from death, stronger, harder. The chanting reached its climax. The old priest took a deep breath and plunged his arms downward. The icy, death-scented seawater instantly swallowed the small bundle, submerging the newborn infant's tender red face. There was no crying, only a few weak, waterlogged bubbles struggling to rise from the gaps in the wrapping, before immediately bursting. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Time froze amidst the howling wind and waves. King Corin involuntarily held his breath, his broad shoulders leaning slightly forward, his gaze locked intensely on the churning water. The tension was evident in his tightly furrowed brow and clenched fists. 12-year-old Balan did not dare blink, his small body rigid as a stone, his fingernails nearly digging into his palms. Captain Dagmar looked grave, his hand resting on the hilt of the dagger at his waist. The younger priest nervously swallowed. Fine beads of sweat broke out on the old priest's forehead, mixing with the cold seawater and running down. He felt the struggles of the small body in his arms completely cease. It became cold and slack, like a dead fish pulled from the deep sea. A heavy despair began to spread across his fanatic eyes. Coldness, darkness, suffocation. Huang Zhengdao felt himself being crushed, dissolved, his consciousness like a wisp of smoke ready to dissipate. Just as this consciousness was about to completely fade into nothingness, the suction force from the abyss that had dragged him into the whirlpool suddenly reversed. It was as if an invisible giant hand reached into the icy sea abyss, precisely seizing his remnant soul, and then, with an irresistible, tearing force, violently yanked it outward. Boom! It wasn't sound, but an indescribable, violent collision and compression on the level of the soul. He felt himself forcibly crammed into an extremely narrow, cold, stiff container that was rapidly losing its last vestiges of life. A violent sense of rejection, like billions of red-hot steel needles, pierced every crevice of his soul. Unfamiliar nerve endings transmitted the near-death sensation of suffocation and coldness, and a weak yet intensely unwilling residual consciousness, full of primal savagery, was furiously biting and resisting his intrusion. Goo! Just as the infant's body in the old priest's arms became completely cold and rigid, as the light of hope was about to die in Corin's eyes, and as Balan instinctively took half a step back, an extremely faint, bizarre sound came from the seawater-soaked swaddling clothes. The old priest's arms trembled violently. Immediately afterward, the small, bluish-purple body convulsed violently. Cough, cough. Wah! A corner of the gray seaweed cloth wrapping was violently ripped open, and a jet of murky seawater mixed with mucus shot out of the infant's mouth and nose like a tiny fountain, hitting the unprepared old priest squarely in the face. Immediately, a genuine, loud, and piercing baby's cry violently tore through the howling sea wind, exploding in everyone's ears. Wah! The cry was full of terror, pain, and an indescribable bewilderment of having survived a great calamity. The deathly silence around the altar was completely shattered. Clan Chief Corin gasped sharply. His tall body swayed, and the color instantly drained from his face, only to be replaced by immense ecstasy and disbelief. He instinctively took a step forward. 12-year-old Balan looked stunned by the sudden cry, his small face pale, his eyes wide and round. His body froze in place. All pretense of composure vanished, leaving only the shock of a child faced with something beyond comprehension. Captain Harrig let out a low gasp, and the younger priest trembled with excitement. The despair on the old priest's face was instantly replaced by a near-frantic flush. He trembled violently with excitement. He violently hoisted the infant high above his head, roaring with all his might, his voice distorted by extreme elation and reverence, echoing in the wind and waves. Look, Ironborn, look, the drowned god has revealed himself. He has granted a miracle. Cold seawater ran down his raised arms, dripping onto the infant's violently heaving, mucus-covered little chest. The baby's crying gradually subsided, leaving only the rapid, gasping breaths of one who had narrowly escaped death. His newly opened eyes, under the horrified gaze of the crowd, displayed a startling heterochromia. The left eye was a pure, deep black, like an ancient well that seemed to absorb all light. The right eye was an icy azure, like the purest sea surface on the eve of a storm. The drowned god has chosen this child. The old priest's voice was fanatical and hoarse, like a blood-crying horn. He grants our Lord rebirth. This is the drowned god's incarnation walking among men. He is the hope for the future of the Iron Islands. He is the clear proof that what is dead may never die, but rises again. What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. The old priest shrieked again himself. Captain Harrig and the younger priest immediately knelt down in excitement, their foreheads striking the cold, wet rocks, repeating the sacred prayer. What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. Clan Chief Corin did not kneel immediately. He strode forward, practically snatching the faintly crying, violently heaving infant from the old priest's hands. Corin's rough fingers carefully wiped away the sticky seawater and mucus from the baby's face, his fingertips trembling imperceptibly as they touched the small, cold, slippery body. His gaze, like that of the most seasoned captain examining a surviving chart after a storm, was solemn and sharp as he scrutinized the infant's heterochromatic eyes, the left eye black as an abyss that swallowed all light, the right eye blue as the fiercest seawater before a storm. There was no paternal warmth in that look, only a heavy, complex scrutiny, as if he had instantly shouldered the entire future of the Iron Islands. Corin Greyjoy's deep voice overpowered the priest's fanaticism. He held the loudly crying, flailing infant high above his head and shouted with undeniable authority and the excitement of survival. This is my son, an Ironborn of House Greyjoy, Euron Greyjoy. Euron Greyjoy. The others followed, shouting the name, celebrating the rebirth of the Iron Islands' second son. Corin turned and handed Euron to Balon, instructing him, "Take your brother back to the castle, wrap him well in warm lambskin, and give him to your mother." 12-year-old Balon gazed at his heterochromatic brother in his arms, standing like a small rock frozen by the sea wind. He watched his father take the brother who had returned from the dead from the priest's hands, observing the complex light in his father's eyes, a mix of ecstasy and heavy apprehension he had never seen before. He looked at his brother's strange, unsettling heterochromatic eyes. A cold, unfamiliar feeling, like a deep-sea current, quietly washed over young Balon's heart for the first time. His emotions were complex. The excitement of a bloodline relative being born and being a big brother for the first time, mixed with a vague wariness and rejection, as if his territory had been invaded and attention stolen. Cold waves beat against the rock altar, and the murky seawater sloshed in the basin, reflecting the kneeling priests and captain, reflecting Clan Chief Corin, who held the infant with a solemn expression, and also reflecting the isolated eldest son, Balon, standing on the shore with complex, shifting eyes. Deep within that small body, which had just undergone the reincarnation of life and death, two vastly different souls, Huang Zhengdao from another world and the newborn, instantly dead Euron Greyjoy, were slowly and irreversibly merging in this cold, salty hell, in a painful and bizarre manner. Their destiny, from the very first moment of arrival, was deeply wedged into the future of House Greyjoy, hanging heavy in the heart of their father, Corin, who sought reform yet embraced this miracle, and quietly casting the first shadow upon the heart of the elder brother, Balon Greyjoy, which was still tender but already beginning to harden. Chapter 2 Euron Greyjoy. Deep within the towering stone fortress of Pike Island, a stone chamber was barely kept free of the damp, cold air characteristic of the Iron Islands by the leaping flames in the fireplace. The air was filled with the musty scent of parchment, the faint bitterness of ink, and the subtle saltiness that the sea wind could never entirely wash away. This was the dwelling and small library of Pike Island's maester. 3-year-old Euron Greyjoy sat on an oak chair that was far too large for him, his feet dangling. He was wrapped in a thick woolen sweater, which made his small, baby-fat chubby face appear even paler. What was most striking were his eyes. The left eye was like a bottomless ancient well, absorbing the room's light, displaying a near-pure, inky blackness. The right eye was an astonishingly clear, icy blue, like the sea before a storm. "The Iron Islands have always been the most barren territory in the Seven Kingdoms," said Pike Island's old maester, Cleggan, a white-haired, slightly hunchbacked man whose eyes were still sharp. He stood beside Euron, his cloudy gaze filled with uncertainty and a hint of indescribable reverence. "But our ancestors measured out a domain vaster than Westeros with their longships. Come, let us get acquainted with the great House Greyjoy sigil today, shall we?" Maester Cleggan carefully unfurled a thick piece of parchment, its edges worn and color darkened. The design on the paper carried an imposing savage aura. A monstrous kraken, its coiled, thick tentacles covered in suckers, seemed ready to burst from the paper and drag everything into the abyss. Heavy scales covered its body, and the two eyes on its head, one deep as a starless night, the other cold as the fiercest water before a storm, stared intently at the viewer. Against the pure black background, only the kraken was meticulously embroidered with shining gold thread, radiating an unsettling majesty in the dim light. Look, this is the golden kraken. Maester Clegan's withered fingers traced the parchment with deliberate reverence. It is a symbol of strength. It is proof that we Ironborn can breathe, fight, and rule beneath the waves. The sea is our hunting ground, and the kraken is us. He tried hard to inject his voice with passion a child could understand. We, House Greyjoy, Clegan's voice continued, trying to draw the young master's thoughts back, are descendants of the Grey King. Do you know the Grey King? He was a great being, even older than the children of the forest on the continent of Westeros. Legend says he married a mermaid and ruled all the kingdoms beneath the waves. His bloodline surges through our veins. The maester's tone was decisive. Maester Clegan slowly unfolded a yellowed map, a map of the Iron Islands, and gradually explained the long history of the Iron Islands to Euron, referencing the map. The Iron Islands are located in Ironman's Bay, in the Sunset Sea off the Westeros continent's western coast, extending east to the Trident and the Neck. The Iron Islands are scattered across the Sunset Sea like a broken chain, consisting mainly of 31 islands. 7 main islands surrounded by 21 smaller islands. The 7 main islands are Pike Island, Great Wyke, Old Wyke Island, Harlaw, Saltcliffe, Blacktide, and Oak Isle. Some of the 21 smaller islands are used for sheep grazing, and others are uninhabited. Pike Island is like a broken spear pointing toward the continent, and Pike Castle stands upon perilous cliffs supported by 3 sea stacks. The volcano on Great Wyke still smokes, and the ruins of the Grey King's Hall on Old Wyke Island are older than Valyria. Harlaw is like a beached whale, Saltcliffe is covered in honeycomb caves, and Blacktide is the domain of House Blacktide. Oak Isle, formerly known as Oakhaven, during the reign of the Iron King House Hoare, merchants and trade fleets traveled between Oak Isle and Lannisport, Old Town, and even the Free Cities, bringing unimaginable wealth to the Iron Islands. He picked up a charcoal stick and began sketching on another piece of rough parchment. Look, young Lord Euron, this is our Iron Islands. He drew a few crooked circles like a string of scattered stones. The biggest one is our home, Pike Island. The others are Great Wyke, Old Wyke, Harlaw. His finger pressed firmly on the circle representing Harlaw. The powerful House Harlaw. They possess the best shipyards, capable of building longships that can cut through storms. His tone held deliberate emphasis. And here, Great Wyke. Clegan's charcoal stick pointed to another slightly larger circle, his voice adding a touch of caution. Lives House Goodbrother. They are descendants of black blood Goodbrother, ancient and very proud. They value tradition. He avoided the specific meaning of tradition, merely drawing a simple anchor nearby. Here, Old Wyke Island, the charcoal moved, is the domain of Drudge family. The Kingsmoot. Do you know? A long, long time ago, the king of the Iron Islands was not born to the role. He was chosen by all the captains at the Kingsmoot. Drudge family presides over this ancient ceremony. The maester's tone carried a nostalgia for past glory. And here, Blacktide, House Blacktide, he drew a wave at that location. They are the drowned god's most faithful servants, the most fearless warriors in the waves. Finally, the charcoal landed on a solitary small dot, located at the western tip of Great Wyke. Lonely Light, House Farwind. The maester paused, as if choked by an invisible sea fog. They are very special, rarely leaving their castle, mysterious like the mist on the sea. He drew a small lighthouse symbol. This map, composed of rough lines and symbolic markers, was the embryonic form of the world in Euron's eyes. Pike Island was the core, and the other islands were the surrounding visible and hidden reefs. Those names, Goodbrother, Drum, Blacktide, Farwind, were like hazards marked on a nautical chart, pressing heavily into his nascent understanding with the indescribable weight in Maester Clegan's tone. They were tightly bound to the heavy concepts of strength, pride, ancient ceremony, pious followers, and mystery. The lords, Maester Clegan concluded, trying to force a kindly smile, are like the kraken's tentacles reaching in all directions. They must hold fast to the reef that belongs to Greyjoy. Only then can the great ship of the Iron Islands sail steadily through the storm. Lord Colin quarreled with the captains again this morning. Maester Clegan sighed, his knuckles tapping the location of Lannisport. This is the 3rd time he has proposed forming a merchant fleet, and the third time it has been rejected. Euron's fingertip traced the sea between the Iron Islands and the continent on the map. He remembered his father Qhorin Greyjoy's reform plan, replacing reaving with iron or trade, replacing paying the iron price with dock taxes, and even proposing the construction of statues of the Seven at Pike Castle to improve relations with the continent. These ideas were more terrifying to the Ironborn than the others. Drudge family called it a blasphemy against the drowned god. The maester whispered, "Yesterday, a fisherman carved, 'We take what is ours on the Pike Castle dock.'" Euron nodded and said lightly, "That is House Greyjoy's motto." The sound of the waves outside the window suddenly became deafening. Euron knew this motto, etched into the soul of House Greyjoy. They believed the drowned god created the Ironborn specifically to take the wealth of the weak. But at this moment, with his father Qhorin Greyjoy proposing reforms, replacing reaving with trade, carving House Greyjoy's motto on the dock was no compliment. Instead, it was an iron spear pointed at House Greyjoy, mocking and accusing Qhorin Greyjoy of abandoning his family's vows, the traditions of the Iron Islands, and the Ironborn. It was rumored that a fisherman had carved the words, but fishermen who could write were rarer than three-legged fish on the Iron Islands. Euron understood this but did not voice it. As the second son of the Greyjoy clan chief, he had been the center of attention since birth, the incarnation of the drowned god walking among men, living proof that what is dead may never die but rises again. The future hope of the Iron Islands, in the mouths of the old priests, and his unique congenital heterochromia, one eye black and one blue. Almost every Ironborn on the Iron Islands knew Euron by the title Son of the Drowned God. But at the age of 3, he could not yet bear the weight of these various titles. The tallest tree catches the most wind. The highest pile attracts the strongest current. The man who stands above others will be criticized by the crowd. Euron understood this principle, so he had to learn to hide until he possessed sufficient strength. Keep a low profile to survive longer. Euron would remind himself of this before speaking or acting every time. The recent conversation had strayed from the theme of his introductory education, so Maester Clegane shook his head and continued today's lesson, his quill sketching key points in the history of the Iron Islands on the parchment. 300 years ago, when King Harren the Black built Harrenhal in the Riverlands, we ruled the western coast from Bear Island to the Arbor. Until the conquest, Aegon's Dragonflame destroyed the Iron Fleet, and the scene of the king who knelt, Qhorin Greyjoy, surrendering his crown still wounds the pride of the Ironborn today. Nominally, the Iron Islands now submit to the Iron Throne, but the ghost of Corwyn the Kingmaker, the Reaver, lives in the heart of every captain. Euron saw the old maester's hand tremble over the Targaryen sigil. Maester Clegane was born and raised in the Iron Islands. Even after more than a decade of maester life at the Citadel, the stories of the Iron Islands still flowed in his blood, never forgotten. Maester Clegane displayed the map in front of Euron and asked, "Euron, do you know where you are?" "Here, Pike Castle, the seat of House Greyjoy." Euron's voice was clear but carried a strange certainty. Clegane raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Very accurate, my lord. Your father will be proud of you." Euron did not respond. His gaze swept over the other islands, Great Wyke, Old Wyke Island, Harlaw. Every name evoked memories of the original story in his mind. He knew which families held sway on these islands and how they would choose their allegiance in the future. "Maester," Euron suddenly asked, "why do the Ironborn call themselves Ironborn?" Clegane stroked his beard, a habit he had when thinking. "That is an ancient tradition, my lord. Our ancestors believed the drowned god forged the Ironborn from iron, the Undulls from soft gold, and all other races from mud." Euron nodded, but in his mind, he recalled his knowledge of modern metallurgy. Iron was indeed harder than bronze, but it rusted easily. The metaphor was surprisingly accurate. "The Ironborn's way of life is different from the other kingdoms," Clegane continued. "We pay the iron price, not with gold and silver." "The iron price?" "Paying with swords and axes, my lord. We take what we want." Clegane's voice held pride. "Such is Old Way." Old Way was merely another term for reaving and raiding. In Ironborn culture, warriors paid the iron price by taking spoils from defeated enemies, rather than purchasing items with currency or money. The Ironborn's thralls and salt wives were also acquired through reaving. They would never be obtained through purchase or trade. Using money to buy things was considered a disgrace by the Ironborn. No matter what the item, only things taken without paying were truly prized. Euron's lips curled into a slight smile. He remembered the disaster caused by King Balon's attempt to revive Old Way in the original story, and he also remembered Euron's even more extreme actions in the original story. "Father wants to change these things," Euron suddenly said. Clegan's expression visibly stiffened. "Lord Colin certainly has some innovative ideas." Euron knew his father, Qhorin Greyjoy, was trying to integrate the Iron Islands into the mainstream culture of the Seven Kingdoms. In the original story, this attempt ended in failure, causing House Greyjoy to lose power for a time. But now, with his intervention, history might take a different direction. Over the course of 3 years, after a period of confusion and incomprehension, Huang Zhengdao finally chose to accept his current identity and the reality that he had transmigrated into the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. "Tell me about the sigils and mottos of the other families, Maester Clegane." Euron changed the subject. Clegane breathed a sigh of relief and began pointing to the map and explaining. "Besides House Greyjoy ruling Pike Island, Great White is controlled by Drudge family. Their sigil is bones and chains." Euron listened attentively, cross-referencing every detail with the information in his memory. Drudge family would support Balon in the future. House Stonetree's sigil was a rock held by a kraken's tentacle. House Merlin's motto was, "Dead Men Rise." Some of these families would remain loyal to Greyjoy, while others would betray him at a crucial moment. Chapter 3: Knowledge is Power. "Euron!" A booming voice came from outside the door. Qhorin Greyjoy strode into the room, the scent of sea breeze accompanying him. He was tall, his black hair flecked with silver, and the scars on his face told the stories of countless naval battles. "Father!" Euron slid off the chair and performed a slightly clumsy bow. Colin laughed, picking up his son. "What did my little kraken learn today?" "The status of the various families, father," Euron answered, then added unexpectedly. "And about your wish to abolish Old Way." Colin's smile froze. He looked sternly at Maester Clegane, who quickly shook his head, indicating he had not been the one to tell the child. "How do you know this, son?" Colin placed Euron back on the floor and crouched down to meet his eyes. Euron blinked, putting on an innocent expression. "I heard you and Brother Balon arguing, stopping Brother Balon from going out to raid on the ships. You said Old Way makes the Iron Islands poor." Colin's expression became complicated. He stroked Euron's head. "You are still too young to understand these things. Old Way is how our ancestors lived. Changing it is not easy." Not easy was an understatement. Forming a good habit is difficult, but trying to change a tradition that has lasted for hundreds or thousands of years is as hard as reaching the heavens. Euron knew the dilemma his father faced. The Iron Islands were barren and rocky, producing almost no food except fish and seaweed. The Ironborn lived by raiding, but this lifestyle had become increasingly unsustainable after the Targaryen dynasty unified Westeros. "Father," Euron suddenly said, "if the Ironborn do not raid, how do we live?" Colin was surprised by his son's insight. "Trade, son. Using our iron ore and salted fish to exchange for grain. Building merchant ships instead of longships." "But will the other families agree?" Colin gave a wry smile. "That is precisely the problem. Your brother Balon is strongly against it." Euron thought of the opinionated Balon Greyjoy from the original story, the stubborn figure who caused the Iron Islands' 2 failed rebellions. Balon was only 15 now, but his personality was already apparent. What was more troublesome was that Balon Greyjoy was the eldest son and would inherit his father Colin's title and rule. If the father and son did not share the same vision, how could they convince the other lords? "I support you, father," Euron said seriously. Colin didn't take it seriously but still laughed heartily, lifting his son high. "You have a political stance at only 3 years old? My little kraken will surely become an excellent lord one day." After Colin left, Euron returned to the window. On the distant horizon, a longship was sailing into the harbor, the golden kraken of House Greyjoy painted on its sail. He knew it was one of the ships his father had sent to Lannisport for trade, loaded with iron ore and salted fish. "My lord," Clegane said softly, "do you truly understand what your father is trying to do?" Euron turned around, his dark blue eyes unusually bright in the dim room. "Better than anyone, Maester. The Iron Islands must change, or they will eventually be discarded by history." Clegane gasped. Such words coming from the mouth of a 3-year-old child were chilling. The following days were repetitive and uneventful, but Euron's learning progress was astonishingly fast. Not only did he master the status of the various families on the Iron Islands, but he also began learning basic navigation knowledge and weapon usage. Colin was surprised by his youngest son's talent and specially made him a small wooden sword. Every afternoon, Euron would appear punctually on the training ground paved with white sea salt to receive warrior training. Grip tighter, Euron. Uncle Balf guided him gruffly on the training grounds of Pike. This strong man, who would become the future admiral of the Iron Fleet, was currently a young man in his early 20s, his muscles as solid as ship cables. An Ironborn holds his sword as tightly as he holds a lover's waist. He seemed to forget that he was only instructing a 3-year-old child, who neither knew what a lover was nor how one should hold a lover's waist. Euron gripped the wooden sword with both hands and adopted a defensive posture. Baff Greyjoy laughed and brought his wooden sword down, which Euron barely managed to block, the impact sending him sprawling onto the ground. Not bad. Balf pulled him up and tapped Euron's sea salt-dusted backside with the wooden sword. Much stronger than Balon was at 3. Euron slapped away his Uncle Balf's hand, gripped the wooden sword tightly, and said with determination, "Again!" This world was never peaceful. There were wars between men, the war of the Game of Thrones, and the future war against the others. To survive, he had to learn how to use a longsword and shield to protect himself. After training ended, Euron went alone to the castle's library. Pike did not have many books. Most were navigation logs and war records. He stood on his tiptoes and pulled a worn copy of the Reigns of the Kings of Westeros from the shelf. "My lord, you can already read?" Clegan's surprised voice came from behind him. Euron did not answer but opened the book, pointing to the text and reading aloud. "The sea snake Corlys Velaryon, Lord of the Tides, once during the Dance of the Dragons." Clegan's beard trembled. "Gods above. You are a prodigy, my lord." Euron smiled bitterly internally. Possessing the memories of an adult, he could naturally read, but he had to control his progress to avoid arousing too much suspicion. He pretended to read with difficulty, occasionally consulting Clegane on the pronunciation of certain words. At sunset, Euron was called to the family hall for dinner. Colin sat at the head of the table, next to Euron's mother, Lady Sansa, a slender woman from Blackcrown. Sitting on either side of the long table were his brother Balon and his uncle Balf. "I hear you made progress again today, Euron," Colin said with a smile, cutting the salted fish on his plate. Balon snorted. "What use is reading? A true Ironborn should learn to command a longship and swing a battle-axe." Colin frowned. "Balon, how many times have I told you? Times are changing." Euron's attitude toward learning is commendable. Balon's 15-year-old face was full of defiance. Euron observed the future King Balon, noting the stubbornness in his eyes. In the original story, it was Balon's obstinacy that led to the 2 failed rebellions of the Iron Islands and the ultimate ruin of his family. "Brother," Euron suddenly said, "reading can help us fight better." Balon scoffed. "How does it help?" "By understanding the enemy's history and culture," Euron replied calmly. "Knowing that House Redwine of the Arbor likes to poison wine helps us avoid being ambushed. Understanding the pride of the Lannister family allows us to use that to set traps. Knowing the mottos and banners of various families helps us understand their way of doing things. Only by being familiar with the lifestyles and fighting methods of people from different regions can we better defeat them. There is an ancient saying in the East, 'Know yourself and know your enemy, and you will win 100 battles.'" The hall suddenly fell silent. Everyone stared at the 3-year-old child, unable to believe these words came from him. Especially that ancient saying from the East which made perfect sense, yet they had never heard it, leaving them profoundly shocked. Colin, who had been eating with his head bowed, was the first to recover after hearing the words of his second son, Euron. He laughed and pounded the table. "Well said. My son will surely become the smartest lord of the Iron Islands." The burden of being a reformer weighed heavily on him. He had proposed abolishing slavery, opening trade ports, and even allowing cultivators of the 7 gods onto the islands, all to drag the Iron Islands out of the bloody, rusty mire of Old Way. But his eldest son, Balon, had consistently opposed his reforms, filling Colin with the anger of disappointment. He turned and roared sternly, "Learn to think with a quill, not an axe. The Ironborn need a new anchor. Learn properly from your younger brother. Read more books, and stop playing those finger games with those filthy sailors." Balon's face darkened. He angrily stabbed the food on his plate and said nothing more. A new anchor? A new anchor? Or perhaps a new heir? The stubborn Balon knew that his differing philosophy from his father had caused much conflict and argument, but he would never compromise, not even if his father used the status of heir as a threat. He glanced at his composed younger brother Euron, his eyes filled with disdain. a brat who only knew how to fawn over his father. After dinner, Euron was allowed a moment of free time within the castle. He wanted to go to the sea, but he was not permitted. He leaned by the window, gazing at the turbulent sunset sea in the distance. The salty sea breeze ruffled his curly hair, and in his ears was the roar of waves crashing against the rocks. He seemed to have accidentally offended his short-tempered brother again in the dining hall, but Euron did not dwell on it, knowing that greater conflicts would arise between the brothers in the future due to their differing philosophies. The struggle between reformers and traditionalists was inevitable. He recalled the mad actions of Euron in the original story, using the Dragonbinder horn to control dragons, drinking Shade of the Evening to gain precognition, and possibly even performing blood magic rituals. Although those methods were effective, the cost was too high. Now, armed with modern knowledge and historical foresight, perhaps he could find a wiser Tao. "My lord, it is time for bed." The voice of a maid came from afar. Euron took one last look at the dark sea and turned to walk toward the castle. He knew he must consciously cultivate his own influence, connect with key figures of the future, and prepare for the transformation of the Iron Islands. A grown man's soul resided in a 3-year-old body. This was both an advantage and a curse. He had to carefully hide his abnormality while using every opportunity to learn and grow. Behind the stone walls of Pike, the Game of Thrones had already begun, and he, Euron Greyjoy, would no longer be the Mad Crow's Eye from the original story, but an entirely new existence. A ruler representing the fusion of modern wisdom and Ironborn ambition. Returning to his bedroom, Euron knelt beside the bed and offered a short prayer to the drowned god, just like all Iron Island's children. "O drowned god," Euron murmured to himself, "if you truly exist, please grant me the strength to change the destiny of the Iron Islands." Then he climbed into bed, closed his eyes, and began planning his studies for the next day. Fundamentals of navigation, resource distribution of the Iron Islands, and the marriage alliances between the various families. Chapter 4 One Peace System. 2 uneventful years passed on Pike Island. It was 275 AC, and Euron Greyjoy was 5 years old. The dawn was steeped in salty mist, and the damp sea wind, laden with salt, lashed against the reefs. Euron Greyjoy walked barefoot across the slick rocks. The icy seawater washed over his ankles, then retreated, leaving a layer of fine foam. In the distance, the black silhouette of the Silence was faintly visible in the fog. The longship had a shallow draft, its prow carved into the open mouth of a dragon, and 6 brass-rimmed or ports hung on each side. This was the 3rd time he had secretly come to see the ship. Ever since Dagmar the Lipped docked at Pike Island for resupply last month, his older brother Balon Greyjoy had not taken his eyes off it. After that, Balon spent almost every day with Dagmar and his crew, drinking, boasting, and sharpening axes. Balon had long wanted to go reaving, and the Silence offered him the chance. A wise man does not stand beneath a crumbling wall. If he had a choice, Euron would rather stay in the safety of the castle. But 3 days ago, when he first stepped barefoot into the sea, he heard a sound that made his heart race. Ding! Host contact with seawater detected. Pirate King System activation progress. 1%. The drowned god bless, he finally had a golden finger. The tide surged in, covering his ankles, cold yet carrying a strange sense of intimacy. Euron suddenly saw an octopus 3 inches underwater, hiding in a rock crevice. Not with his eyes, but sensed through the vibrations of the water. He tentatively walked into deeper water, but as soon as the sea reached his knees, the guard behind him yanked him back. Pirate King System activation progress. 1.01%. The Pirate King system will officially open when activation reaches 100%. A single long voyage might be enough to fully activate the system. Euron gazed at the Silence, unconsciously stirring the seawater with his fingers. To change fate, whether his own, his father's, his brother's, his unborn nieces and nephews, or even that of the entire Iron Islands, required power. And the Silence offered him just that opportunity. A young lord shouldn't be coming to a place like this. When those sailors get drunk, they won't even respect a young lord, let alone a great lord or a king, the old fisherman Wick said, standing on the shore, blocking Euron's view with a hand missing 2 fingers. "If your father knew you sneaked aboard last night, if you don't say anything and I don't say anything, my father naturally won't know." 5-year-old Euron was permitted to move outside the castle walls, accompanied by a guard, but only along a small stretch of coastline. Old fisherman Wick's loyalty, bravery, and fighting ability made Corrin feel completely at ease. and he was temporarily serving as Euron's guard. The sea fog was suddenly blown open by a gust of wind. Euron saw a tower-like figure standing by the rudder wheel at the stern. Dagmar's chin was split in half, the origin of his nickname, the Lipped, held together by iron rings, and dark red golden kraken would leak out every time he drank. Legend said he had single-handedly cut down 7 mere sailors in the Stepstones, and the gold-threaded belt he stole was now cinched around his greasy leather armor. Euron pointed to a long string of objects hanging on the mast and asked, "What are those?" Old Fisherman Wick let out a guttural sound. "Ears. The ones that haven't dried yet belong to Lysini merchants. The Silence recently raided a merchant ship. Every ear represents a successful reaving." His tone was tinged with envy, as if the instinctual desire for reaving in his blood had been ignited. Euron pulled a silver stag from his pocket and tossed it to Old Wyke. "I forgot to congratulate you. Your youngest son must be 3 months old now, right? Spend more time with him. They grow up fast, and they won't be so cute then." The old fisherman caught the silver coin steadily and chuckled, understanding the implication in Euron's words, that he should abandon the idea of going out to reave. He nodded. "The young lord is right. At Old Wyke's age, I'm only fit for catching fish in Iron Man's Bay. Has the little prince come to inspect his fleet again?" Dagmar's voice was rougher than the waves, but his tone was affectionate. He crouched by the reef, the split in his iron-ringed chin still sticky with last night's mead. He lifted Euron like a kitten, his large hand, missing 3 fingers, surprisingly gentle. "Your brother is about to do something foolish." Dagmar wiped Euron's wet hands dry with his leather armor. "But I suppose the little kraken figured that out already?" The damp wooden planks suddenly creaked. Balon stepped out from behind a pile of cargo. The 18-year-old was more robust than most warriors, his leather vest stained with ale and women's perfume from last night's revelry. A freshly sharpened axe was tucked into his waist, the blade glinting with a bluish-gray light in the morning mist. "Is the little mouse spying on me?" Balon grabbed Euron by the collar, his breath, smelling of sea salt, hitting Euron's face. "Trying to rat out your dear brother?" Euron's feet dangled in the air. He saw a new scar on the side of Balon's neck, a mark left by the whipcorn the Great Lord had used 3 days earlier, when his father had roared that the eldest son of Greyjoy should not carouse like a common pirate. Euron blinked. "The eastern reefs will be submerged by the high tide tonight." He pointed to the Silence. "With the southwest wind, you can sail out of father's sight before dawn." Balon's blue eyes narrowed into slits. The sound of the crew gathering horn drifted from afar, and the Silence was pulling up its gangplank. "Little brother." Balon's voice was tight like a taut sail rope. "If you tell father." His hand rested on the axe handle, but his eyes were evasive, like a child caught doing wrong. A smart person knows when to keep quiet. He tossed Euron onto the wet sand like a piece of fish, and as he strode toward the longship, he warned without looking back. "If mother asks, tell her I went to Old Wyke Island to seek a trial by combat against the stone trees. Mother won't believe that." Euron stood up, brushed the sand off his backside, and snorted. "Even a 3-year-old knows what you're going to do with Dagmar." Balon spun around fiercely, his eyes vicious. "You little bastard. Do you want me to tie you to the reef and let you taste the drowning ritual again?" Euron grinned. "I won't report you, unless you let me go to sea with the Silence." Old Fisherman Wick was dumbfounded. "Go to sea?" Balon burst into laughter. "Go to sea? Do you think we're going fishing?" "No, not fishing. You're going to raid merchant ships. You're only 5. Even if I'm 5, I am Ironborn, the son of Corran Greyjoy, and the young lord of the Iron Islands." Balon gnashed his teeth in anger. "Swords are blind, blood will fly. Do you think reaving is child's play? The old maester and his pile of moldy parchment are waiting for you in the tower. Didn't you always say that studying is useless, and that true Ironborn should learn to command a longship and wield a battle-axe?" Euron challenged him. "Or are you saying you want your 5-year-old brother to charge ahead? Or perhaps that Balon Greyjoy, hailed as the Iron Island's finest swordsman, can't even protect his own little brother?" Balon's face flushed. He grabbed Euron by the collar, his gap-toothed smile looking ferocious in the morning light. "Since you're not afraid to die, then I'll let you witness the true meaning of Old Way." Old Fisherman Wick stepped in front of Balon, his thick hand gripping the axe handle, his eyes sharp. "Put the young lord down." Balon put Euron down, flashed a grin at Wick, and drew his long sword. "The old man only has eyes for the young lord. but I am the future great lord of the Iron Islands. What is it, old man? Do you want to test how sharp my sword is? This is my personal decision, and it has nothing to do with either of you. Euron waved his hand at old fisherman Wick and laughed loudly. Wick, go back and tell my father that I will return with a ship full of spoils in half a month at the shortest, or a month at the longest. Seeing that he couldn't stop him, old fisherman Wick jumped onto the ship, his face pale. I am your guard. If you go to sea recklessly, how can I go back and face the Great Lord? Even if the Great Lord doesn't kill me, I won't have the face to show up. The sails of the Silence were raised. The black sail bore the sigil of Dagmar's family, a sea serpent biting its own tail. As the last mooring rope was untied, a small banner suddenly rose to the top of the mast. The Greyjoy golden kraken coiled ferociously in the morning light. Euron's lips curved slightly. System activation progress. 1.5%. Chapter 5 Voyages and Plunder. Qhorin Greyjoy once had 3 sons, born to his first wife, Merrill of House Stoneharrow from Harlaw. Harlan Greyjoy, his first son, died in infancy from grayscale. Quentin Greyjoy, his second son, died as an infant. Donnell Greyjoy, his third son, returned to the embrace of the drowned god at birth, along with his wife. Afterward, Qhorin took his second rock wife, who was the mother of Balon and Euron. Because of the deaths of his previous 3 children, Qhorin cherished and valued his 2 current sons even more. 18-year-old Balon was incredibly strong. He had defeated many battle-hardened and murderous pirates in finger dance duels, and his swordsmanship could rival that of his uncle Baff Greyjoy, now known as the foremost knight of the Iron Islands. 5-year-old Euron, on the other hand, had attracted attention since birth. His reputation as the son of the drowned god, with his mismatched eyes and resurrection from death, had spread throughout the Iron Islands, and his intelligence and resilience astonished everyone who met him. One a warrior, one a scholar, they represented the future and hope of the Iron Islands. But now, these 2 beloved sons of the Iron Islands king were both on his silence, ready to follow him to the stepstones to raid merchant ships. Lipped Dagmar felt immense pressure, and the thrill of raiding suddenly diminished significantly. But the sails were already hoisted. There was no turning back. Unless they were laden with spoils or his own corpse, he would never return. Pike's dock before dawn was steeped in a salty mist, the damp wooden planks sinking slightly underfoot, oozing black seawater, as if the drowned god was licking the ships about to depart. Euron Greyjoy walked barefoot over piles of ropes, the fine grit and shells grating against his soles, the icy seawater washing over his ankles, then receding, leaving a layer of fine foam. The black silhouette of the Silence was faintly visible in the morning mist, the longship's low gunnels like a lurking sea beast, the dragon's mouth carved on its prow wide open, as if ready to devour distant prey at any moment. Remember, little Kraken? Dagmar rubbed Euron's curly hair with his calloused hand, his cracked jaw gleaming with the cold light of an iron ring in the morning sun. His voice was like a reef polished by the sea wind, rough but with a strange rhythm. The sound of the waves speaks. A gentle lapping is safety. A hissing sound means shallows, and if you hear a thudding, the old pirate made a sinking gesture, a gurgling laugh escaping his throat. That's the reef gnawing at your hull, and the drowned god knocking on your coffin lid. Euron nodded, his mismatched eyes sweeping over the deck, his left eye like an abyss swallowing light, his right eye as cold as the sea before a storm. A transmigration soul resided in his 5-year-old body, but at this moment, he had to learn like a true Ironborn. He reached out and touched the hull, the rough planks leaving tiny splinters in his palm, carrying the salty bitterness of seawater. The sea wind suddenly became urgent, carrying a salty omen. Balon Greyjoy stood by the rudder, motionless as a bronze statue, his 18-year-old muscles taut beneath his leather armor, his gaze fixed on the gradually lightening horizon. The scars from his father Qhorin's whipping still marked his neck, the dark red scabs like a twisted sea serpent, but at this moment, his mind was entirely focused on the distant raid. Dagmar was performing the outgoing ritual at the bow, the old pirate anointing the eyes of the carved sea monster with whale oil, his hoarse voice blending with the sea wind. Open your eyes, old friend, and lead us to plump prey. 53 sailors were in position, Balon standing by the rudder like a bronze statue. Hoist the sails. Dagmar's roar drowned out the seagulls' cries. The black sails unfurled with a rustle, the banner depicting a sea serpent biting its tail flapping at the masthead. Euron gripped the gunwale rope, feeling the longship's awakening tremor, the creaking of the keel, the humming of taut ropes, the dull thud of waves against the hull. These sounds intertwined in his ears into an Ironborn battle song. Salty spray splashed on his face, carrying a strange vitality. Ding. Pirate King System activation 2.5%. On the third day of the voyage, Euron was caught by Dagmar while observing the sun's angle on the forecastle. Ha! Is our little prince studying navigation? The old pirate lifted him by the scruff of his neck to the rudder, like a kitten, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Watch closely. This is a true Ironborn compass. Dagmar unbuckled his belt and urinated into the sea. If your stream forks against the wind, it means there's an undercurrent. If it's straight with the wind, that's a good omen. He glanced at Euron, grinning. Never mind. You can learn that when you're older. Euron didn't smile. He pointed to a wooden box in the corner of the deck. There's an astrolabe in there. Dagmar raised an eyebrow. A maester's toy. Ironborn don't need that thing. He patted the dagger at his waist. We find our way with this, the instinct of blood and salt. But Euron knew that true navigation was far more than that. The sea charts near the stepstones were an Ironborn secret. Dagmar pulled out a whalebone carved with symbols from his leather armor, marking whirlpools, reefs, and pirate lairs. The bone fragment was polished smooth, its edges rounded, clearly having been consulted countless times. We're about to reach here. He pointed with his missing-fingered hand to a jagged mark on the bone fragment. The Weeping Widow Whirlpool. It swallowed 20 ships. When passing through, you must sprinkle salt on the deck. Otherwise the drowned god will take your helmsman. Euron silently noted it, and as for sprinkling salt on the deck, regardless of whether this action was truly effective, there was no harm in respecting tradition. After all, salt was cheap. Dagmar was experienced, both in navigation and raiding. The navigational knowledge he imparted was not found in books, but for someone who wanted to control the sea, this knowledge was more precious than gold. As the voyage began, the Silence continually ventured deeper into the ocean, heading towards the stepstones, and the Pirate King System activation also gradually increased. Ding. Pirate King System activation 20.5%. On the 7th day of the voyage, Euron witnessed the sea's wrath. The Silence was a typical Ironborn longship, its low gunnels suitable for surprise attacks, and its shallow draft allowed it to run ashore. Its sails were tarred black sails, lighter and faster than the merchant ship sails from Arbor. But when encountering headwinds, the Ironborn would furl the sails and rely entirely on rowing, 6 or positions on each side, manned by the strongest pirates in rotation. Look at the clouds. Balon suddenly appeared behind Euron, pointing to the curling mackerel-scale clouds on the horizon. Those are the drowned god's teeth. A storm is coming. At first, it was just a lead-gray smudge on the horizon. But soon, dark clouds crashed down on the sea like warhammers. Giant waves raised a wall-high curtain of water, and the Silence was tossed onto the crest of a wave like a leaf, then slammed violently into the trough. Euron was flung to the port side and then rolled to the starboard, his fingernails digging into the plank gaps to avoid being washed overboard. Even with ample preparation, the furious sea was still beyond human resistance. Furl the sails. Secure the cargo. Dagmar tied himself to the rudder with a rope, rain leaking through his cracked jaw and spraying out mixed with spittle. Balon, get your brother into the cabin. Balon grabbed Euron like a sack of grain, taking 3 steps in 2, and rushed into the captain's cabin. Under the dim whale oil lamp, the sea chart was already soaked with seawater, the ink blurring into a vague blue-black. Yet Balon pointed precisely to a spot. Remember this location? Devil's Molars, the most dangerous whirlpool area in the Stepstones. If the ship breaks apart, swim northeast. There's a cluster of reefs you can climb onto. Euron stared at his brother's rain-soaked face. At this moment, Balon didn't seem like a brute, but rather a true captain. Outside the cabin came the deafening crash of a mast breaking. Dagmar's curses pierced through the wooden planks. Damn the 7 gods! Old Wyke fell into the sea. Euron suddenly broke free from Balon, grabbed the dagger from the table, cut his palm, and smeared the blood on the doorframe. This was an ancient ritual he had heard from old fisherman Wick, a blood sacrifice to the drowned god. The blood flowed down the doorframe, seeping into the cracks of the wooden planks, as if absorbed by some invisible force. Ding! Host has actively participated in a maritime crisis for the first time. Pirate King System activation increased by 5%. Current activation 65%. A warm current surged into his limbs. Balon stared intently at his brother, just about to grab him back, but he himself was thrown back into the captain's cabin by a giant wave. His fingers, pale with strain, gripped the door crack as he furiously shouted, "Bastard! Get back here!" But his voice was drowned out by the howling wind and roaring waves, and then he saw a miraculous scene. When Euron climbed onto the deck again, he was able to move as if on solid ground on the tilting ship, and even predict the direction of each surge. Euron picked up a rope from the ship's deck and threw it to the portside oarsmen struggling in the giant waves in the sea. The rope seemed to have a life of its own, precisely coiling around Old Wyke's wrist as he tumbled in the waves. After confirming the oarsman had grasped the rope, Euron tied the other end of the rope to an iron nail on the deck. No matter how big the waves or how fierce the wind, Euron was completely unaffected, as if the sea was a part of his own body. Dagmar lay on the ship's planking, his eyes wide. "By the drowned god! Is this little kraken grown onto the ship? Son of the drowned god!" Everyone involuntarily recalled the legend associated with Euron.